have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order.
Hello and welcome to Multipolarity, the podcast. It's been an eventful couple of days. The war is back. A new phase of the war, which in some ways is less intense than the previous phase of the war. Basically the capacity for the United States to strike Iran is vastly diminished for a variety of reasons. It just doesn't have the assets in the area. It doesn't have the munitions that it had before anymore. And it also, because of current strategic realities, it has to overly focus on coastal regions, because the obsession now has become the Strait of Hormuz, the strait that was open before America launched its initial true phase of the war. This is called digging yourself into a hole, is the technical terminology in military strategic discourse. So in that way, it's more limited, but in another way, it's more expanded, because the war now appears to be expanding to other parts of the Middle East. It's not 100% clear, but on the day of recording Wednesday morning, it appears that the Houthis have gone to war with Saudi Arabia. Funnily enough, I saw on X that the advocates or supporters of the Houthis, and Iran more generally, are now insisting that you don't call the Houthis. You refer to them either as Ansar Allah, which is their official kind of revolutionary insurgent name or political name, or just Yemenis, because they say that they represent the Yemeni people, which to a very large extent they probably do. And after this war with Saudi Arabia, I'm guessing there won't be much non-quote-unquote Houthi influence in Yemen. I suppose a few things to say about the war itself. The Houthis have been at war with Saudi Arabia before. It was a brutal war. A lot of Yemenis died. It was very ugly. It was a few years ago. But the situation has changed drastically since then. In the previous war, it was basically Saudi Arabia with a well-equipped, Western-equipped military, but, not the most competent or not a military that was famous for its fighting prowess, let's just put it that way. But it had modern Western equipment, and it was up against, basically guys with very limited light equipment, AK-47s and so on. And the Saudis were not beyond bombing infrastructure and civilian infrastructure and so on. So I wouldn't say it was quite as dramatic as the IDF versus Gaza, but it was definitely closer to that than any sort of peer competition. That's changed now. The Houthis are obviously well equipped with drones and missiles, and they can carry out a form of guerrilla insurgency war at a distance on Saudi Arabia. What's also changed is that there's no longer any need for proxies or ambiguity in who's fighting who. The Houthis were an Iranian proxy when the Saudis fought them before, and they were also an Iranian proxy when they shut down the Red Sea before. And obviously that's to give, but partly it is an independent group. The idea that these are fully controlled by Iran is nonsense, but it is partly an independent group. Just like you could say the Ukrainian government is an independent group vis-a-vis Russia, although it is a proxy war that's being fought in Ukraine, obviously. It's the same situation, basically. But the main strategic advantage to having a proxy is that you can plausibly deny that you're at war with the country that the proxy is fighting, or doing what the proxy is doing. So Iran could say, we're not at war with Saudi Arabia, or we're not closing the Red Sea. That's the Houthis, who we support, but, they're not us. There's no need for that anymore. Iran is basically at war with the entire Gulf region, and it is explicitly and actively taking control over the shipping lanes there. So at this point, it wouldn't surprise me that the IRGC start just openly operating in Yemen. I mean, why wouldn't they at this stage? They'd probably be significantly better trained than the Houthi army, than Ansar Allah, if you want to call them their correct name. And my guess is during that MOU period of ceasefire, and probably during the war itself, a lot of weapons, advanced weapons, were pouring in to Yemen. in preparation for what's happened now. Um, so what is this all about? Well, it goes back to what I began with, that the United States don't have a lot of cards to play. They played their hand in the first phase of the war, and they showed what they could do, which was not much, let's be honest. It was just kind of bomb Iran kind of randomly. Maybe hit a couple of important targets, hit a lot of decoys. Not that compelling, to be honest. That was their all in. That was their like, okay, I'm going all in moment. And what we're getting now is kind of the US, on a slightly degraded second round, as I said before, where they have to focus on the coastal targets and so on too, because their objectives have changed. Now, it's not about regime change. I think they've given up on that. It's about opening the strait that they closed, in effect, through their own actions. But on the other hand, Iran have another card to play, because after the initial all-in campaign by the Americans, the new strategic reality was that they claimed control over the Strait of Hormuz, but they left the Red Sea open. And so they gave themselves room to escalate. The Americans gave themselves no room to escalate, whereas the Iranians have given themselves ample room to escalate. And that's what we're seeing now. So basically what's happening is that after the war, the initial phase of the war, the strait was closed, and the majority of products coming out of the Middle East through the strait were finished. They weren't coming anymore. And that was not just oil, it was gas, it was LNG from Qatar, it was fertilizer, it was helium, it was all these products. That was all shut down. But there was a backup option of sorts, for oil anyway, not for many other things, but for oil. Basically, Saudi Arabia and UAE had built these pipelines, and they were basically for emergency use only. And the reason for that is because shipping oil directly through the strait was the cheapest way to do things. And you might say to yourself, that's strange. Pipelines are usually cheaper than shipping. And that's true. The issue is that these pipelines dump out at sea. So that, for example, the Saudi Arabian pipeline doesn't go directly to Europe or something like that. It goes to the Red Sea, and then ships are loaded up in the Red Sea. So the pipelines are not true pipelines per se. They're more like pipelines that allow for alternative shipping routes, right? Now, the Saudi pipeline is the one carrying most of the oil, the remaining oil that's coming out of the Middle East, and it dumps out in the Red Sea. Now, some of that oil goes on tankers and goes through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean and to Europe. But of course, the canal is that and the Panama Canal are the true choke points in the world, because they're canals. If you know how a canal works, you'll know that very limited traffic can go through a canal. It's not like a strait. A strait, you may be able to close it, sure, but it's not a canal. A canal is like a man-made platform built for very slow-moving ships, like going right through, taking up most of the space. If people remember, during 2020, a ship got caught in the canal, and it showed how easy it is for it to disrupt those things. So some of it's going through the canal, but I think it's very hard to get numbers, because these numbers have now become subject to propaganda. I'll talk about it in a moment, the entire energy markets, and to some extent the entire financial markets, are now cloaked in the sort of propaganda that you usually associate with warfare itself. So it's hard to get trustworthy numbers. I think it's about 80%. Saudi Arabia are shipping about 4.5 million barrels of oil a day after the closure of the strait. And I think about 80% of that is going through the Red Sea. I think basically all of it is going through the pipeline. 20% or so is going through the Suez Canal, and about 80% is going through the Red Sea. Overall, on my estimate, again, very hard to get good numbers on it, but I think it's a reasonable estimate. Overall, on my estimate, 60% of the remaining oil coming out of the Gulf is going through the Red Sea, through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And so, as of day of recording, the Houthis have enacted a full air and naval blockade on Saudi Arabia. The air blockade is basically undertaken by firing missiles at Saudi Arabia's 3 large airports. That's very painful for Saudi Arabia. It's a major transport hub in the Middle East, and it still relies on being kind of open for business. It has three pretty large airports. And the Houthis are just shutting them down by firing missiles and drones at them. And they can pretty much shut them down for as long as they can fire off missiles and drones, once every 2 or 3 days. Just make it uncertain enough that no one wants to use those airports. And no one really wants to use those airports unless they're fairly certain that, there isn't a 1 in 3 chance that you land on a day when a missile or a drone strikes. That's bad for Saudi Arabia, sure, and it's bad for regional air travel, but the naval blockade is where the rubber really meets the road, because what they mean, of course, by a naval blockade is they're imposing a blockade once again on the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They're perfectly capable of doing this blockade. That should be said first. They did it it must be nearly 2 years ago now. More than 2 years ago, in fact, when they first imposed it. And they're perfectly capable of doing it themselves. But as I said, I expect more munitions have been dumped into Yemen in recent weeks and months. And I would be very surprised if the IRGC is not pretty openly operating in Yemen. So they could close the strait before, they'll close it again. And that remaining oil that was coming out of the Gulf region is finished. So the oil markets have already been kind of on the brink. We've been saying it on the show for a while. What does this mean? Well, it means they're on the brink plus. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the biggest energy catastrophe to happen, certainly since the 73 Saudi Arabian oil embargo. Maybe even bigger. There's a debate to be had about that. There's a lot of moving parts there. American increased energy independence, but also, back in 73 it was just oil. Now it's all these other products that were coming out of the Strait. We'll see. We'll let economic historians judge that in 5 or 10 years when all the data is available and all the propaganda has been put to bed. But the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was a big deal, a very, very big deal. And we're now moving into mid-July, and I think we were already pretty much on the brink. And now we've just had an escalation of it, and we've had, a decent proportion. I'd say closure of the Red Sea is probably 5% at least of global oil supply. We were still getting through there, maybe not 5, maybe 4, somewhere around that. And that shut off after a big, 15% shut off through the Strait, or, 14%. So building pressure. So what has been going on? Well, I think the energy markets become the entire story, right? That's my hypothesis now. I went on Mario Naufal's show just before the latest phase of the war kicked off, and I thought we had an interesting exchange. Mario knows the situation extremely well. I think he's based in UAE. He knows exactly what's going on, and he said, it makes absolutely no sense that the Trump administration will kick this war off again. This is just a day before the war broke out. And he's right. It makes absolutely no sense. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but the war broke out anyway. So what is the thinking in the Trump administration? Well, I can't really speak to their strategic thinking. I think it's not actually strategic thinking. I think it's various political pressures that I don't think anyone has a full, 360-degree view of. So I won't try and add to that cacophony. But what I will say is, I think the pressure would have lessened, or the Trump administration would have had a better excuse not to do what it's currently doing if it thought that the ramifications of closing these important choke points for energy would be felt. Basically what I mean is, I think the oil price manipulation that's been ongoing I think it's been ongoing for years, but certainly since the beginning of the true Iran war, American-Iranian war, if this manipulation hadn't been quote-unquote successful, I don't think we'd be where we are at the moment. Now, I say quote-unquote successful because it's not actually successful. I think we've discussed this before in the past. The manipulation is clearly able to impact the oil futures markets, WTI, Brent. It's even crept in now to the oil spot markets. And that's what I think Trump is watching. I think he's watching the television. I think he's reading the New York Times. And I think he's been given advice probably by the Treasury Secretary and others. And they're pointing to this oil price. But as we've discussed on the show before, I don't think those paper markets mean that much anymore. The crack spread is completely blown out, or somebody corrected me on Twitter. The 3-2-1 crack spread, apparently if you don't say the whole thing, you're a boob. The 3-2-1 crack spread is completely blown out. That's only become more dramatic in recent days. That's the gross refining margin. So what you're paying at the pump is the oil price itself plus the gross refining margin, right? I mean, basically with profit in there and all that kind of thing for them. But basically that's what you're paying at the pump. You're paying the price of a barrel of oil, and you're paying for the refining margin, gross margin. And what's happened is that as the oil price has gone down, the crack spread's gone up to compensate. So we've actually seen $100, $110, $120 barrel of oil consistently throughout, no matter where the future and the spot price of oil has been, because the crack spread just compensates for it. Now, we still don't fully understand what that is. The idea that it's price gouging is completely laughable to me. The other explanation is that a bunch of refining capacity has been knocked out. Some has, certainly in the Middle East. The Russian stuff, more exaggerated in my opinion, but, you know, we can put a little bit in there. But I don't think it explains, I don't think the screw up of refineries explains this. And the reason I say that is because the crack spread seems to move with the Brent. So when the Brent futures price goes down, the crack spread goes up. It seems like a mechanical relationship. So when the Brent crude price goes down, that doesn't mean that a bunch of refiners have been taken offline, if you see what I mean. So I don't think it's refining that's doing this. I think what's actually happening, although I can't prove it, is that the refineries are actually paying a higher price for that oil. I don't know why. It could be higher transportation costs. It could be that the futures market prices just aren't being used. I don't know. But that's what it looks like. But whatever it is, even if it's, you know, the refiners are evil and dastardly and they're somehow increasing their margin and gouging consumers, even if it is that, the end result of all this is the same, that the price at the pump remains high. And so you've got this absurdity where the Trump administration is saying to itself that it's able to completely manipulate the energy markets through like magic wand stuff. I call it printing oil, which is basically what it is, that Scott Bessent is doing at the Treasury. And they've convinced themselves that they've created this magic oil pump, in a sense. You can't even call it a magic money pump because, you know, you can use paper cash to screw around with asset price valuations, bonds, stocks, sure. But they're not physical, right? Oil is physical. So the idea that you can like magically intervene in an energy market is completely superstitious. I mean, it's you know, it's like something a druid would try and do, or a guy doing a rain dance. Like it's primitive, actually. It's a really primitive way of thinking. So basically, I think that's what's happening, that they've convinced themselves that they can manipulate these markets. Meanwhile, the actual reality is the pressure is just building up and up. Now, some of that is already being passed through to consumers. Probably not enough, because I think the oil price futures market still has some impact on price at the pump, consumers, etc. I don't think it has a huge weight, maybe 20% or 25%. So you can get, you know, you can bring gas prices, as Americans call them, down by like 6% or something, doing some crazy market manipulation. But you see it at elevated prices at the pump, but these prices aren't high enough. If we've lost about 15% or 20% of global oil supply, demand needs to fall by 15 or 20%. And oil prices are not high enough to cause demand to fall by that much. They have to go up so much more. Gasoline prices, diesel prices, heating oil prices, jet fuel prices. They've responded a bit better, actually, jet fuel prices. If you've tried to book a flight recently, you'll have noticed that probably has caused some demand destruction. So basically the pressure is building at the same time, hemorrhaging as oil. We've discussed, both private and state inventories are just hemorrhaging oil dangerously. Like usually there's a very strong correlation between a low inventory count and a high oil price. And the reason for that, obviously, is the market is pricing in that the inventories are going to start building, and so oil demand is going to go up. Now you're starting to see low inventories and low oil prices. It makes no sense. The market makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And so the end result is basically inventories are just crashing out to meet this excess demand. And it is excess demand because we're not getting real prices for energy. We're getting these fake, subsidized in effect through paper market manipulation, these fake prices, and we're pretending like everything's normal. And the reason that the cars are still driving and the homes are still heated is because the inventories are just crashing out, We discussed that before. The American inventory SPR is literally going to crash probably before the midterms if they keep it up at this rate. But my fear basically is that the administration doesn't understand this, or vaguely understands this, and that Trump's probably under enormous pressure to get this war won or to get it going or whatever. And, you know, out of every hour that he spends thinking about it, the economics guys, the treasurer or whatever, probably get 5 minutes. And all Trump wants to hear is, yeah, we got the Brent price. He goes, yeah, I saw in the New York Times the Brent price came down. He's like, yes, boss. This is like, we're walking off a cliff here. This is like lemmings. Like, seriously, it's like lemmings, about to walk off a cliff. The energy situation physically is getting worse and worse and worse. The Middle East is in World War III, basically. I mean, we're pretty much in World War III now, let's be honest. Like, with all the wars going on, I hope it doesn't escalate much more, but we're basically in World War III. The Middle East now has these conflicts that'll need to be managed, like, one by one. Like, even, you know, you now have to resolve a Saudi-Yemeni conflict, right? One that, you know, may attack infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and so on. The Houthis can do that. They can attack the airports. They can start attacking the refining capacity and so on in Saudi Arabia. Surely the Saudis know this. I don't know what they're doing getting involved in this. But again, there's no point in speculating. Everyone's speculating on people's motive for doing these crazy things, and I just don't know anymore. So that's where we are. I mean, I know every couple of weeks something happens and I jump on the podcast and say how bad the situation is. It keeps getting worse. And, you know, the haters will go, oh, well, Phil, you've been saying that since the beginning and everything's been fine so far. Every day that things appear normal in lived reality, and every day that the situation itself, the fundamental situation, gets worse and worse, it's just increasing the punch that's coming. And I've given up trying to predict when that punch is coming because things are so crazy. Nothing makes sense. Markets don't make sense. Inventory drawdowns are so crazy. I never thought I'd see anyone allow them. I don't understand the political situation very well. This is a world where there's no point in making any predictions anymore. The only thing you can say is unless some magic is being cast on the world and physical energy supplies don't matter anymore, and we live in some post-reality virtual world where you can just talk down energy prices magically and they go down. I don't know. Unless all that's true, like, something big is coming. Big. Really big. Again, I don't want to put a date on it anymore. But it feels like it's got to be before the midterms. So I joked the other day that I was telling people before to buy a bike. I think I've now moved on to buy a donkey because if we get a massive food crisis on top of the energy crisis, you can eat the donkey. It's the best I have.
About 4 weeks ago, Donald Trump said that he had signed the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding because American oil reserves only had 4 weeks before running out. After which, obviously, the oil price would go crazy, and so would gasoline prices for American motorists. Obviously, with the Strait of Hormuz being shut, he had to do something to reopen it, so he signed what was apparently a very one-sided deal. Since then, the oil reserves haven't been refilled. In fact, they've drawn down yet farther. But now Trump has said that oil is flowing and they're going to return to war and hit Iran really hard. So who do we believe? Do we believe Trump of 4 weeks ago or Trump of today? It actually reminds me, listeners, of a story I once heard about Bob Arum, the legendary boxing promoter. He was well known for ripping people off and stabbing people in the back. In fact, I've heard one person say that whenever he shook hands with Bob Arum, he would check to see if his wedding ring was still there after they'd finished. I heard another person say that when Bob Arum patted him on the back, he always got the impression that he was checking to see where to plunge the knife at a later date. But the really famous story that Trump's mention of the Islamabad Memorandum being necessary to sign because oil reserves only had 4 weeks, or the Strategic Petroleum Reserve only had 4 weeks. It's a story that some boxing manager told about negotiating with Bob Arum. And at some stage in negotiations, he said, "But Bob, you said literally the opposite thing yesterday." And Arum replied calmly and matter-of-factly, "Yeah, but yesterday I was lying, today I'm telling the truth." And obviously, that's been Trump's shtick for some time, and he's actually pretty open about that being his shtick. And it's been very successful for him, those kind of like knowing about turns on what he said yesterday. But that also means, I think, that there's something of a cottage industry that has emerged both among his promoters and his detractors, trying to kind of divine the true motives and meanings of what he says and what he does, because he doesn't necessarily explain them in a way that is believable to everybody or clear to everybody as he's actually doing them. And people think that his pontifications, especially online, are aimed at media communication and manipulation and communication with his base and perhaps even saving face. So what I'd like to do for you guys tonight, now that the Iran war has restarted, or the US is taking a third bite of the cherry after Midnight Hammer last year, the operation this year, the name of which I forget. This is now the third bite of the cherry in the last 12 months. So what I'd like to do is try to offer a framework that would help you make sense of what's happening at the moment, and maybe even why it's happening, rather than just tell you how I think this is going to go. Because a lot of people tell you, oh, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But what I'd like to provide is a framework for trying to understand what is happening. And maybe that will allow you to monitor events, because I know lots of monitoring the situation bros listen to Multipolarity. So it'll allow you guys to monitor the situation and see events as they happen in real time through this framework and make your own judgments. So let's first remind ourselves of the strategic landscape of the hot portion of the war while it was happening, basically from late February until the middle of April. So what happened is the US started the war, and when it started the war, it had 4 main goals in mind. Now these, contrary to what I see as popular opinion, which seldom mentions them for some reason, these war aims were very clearly defined, both by Donald Trump himself when he gave his TV address to the United States nation to announce the onset of hostilities, but also a couple of days before that by the US negotiators who were speaking with the Iranians, and they presented these 4 war aims as kind of like an ultimatum. But then Trump presented them as actual war aims. And what those 4 aims were to totally dismantle Iran's nuclear program, not just take enriched material under US control or de-enrich it, bring it to a lower level of enrichment, or give it to some kind of third party like Russia or maybe China, but actually totally dismantle the whole program. So all of the nuclear material would be given to the United States to dispense with as it saw fit, but there would also be a literal physical dismantling of Iran's nuclear program. The second war aim was to put hard limits on the scale and range of Iran's missile and drone arsenal. So it would only be able to have X number of missile and drones, and those drones it did have would be limited to a certain range. No doubt that range would be kind of just inside where the Israeli border starts, I guess. That was the idea. And then the third thing, the third war aim was to end Iranian funding of its proxy forces in the region, which are like the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Iraqi Shia militias, among others. And then the final war aim, because the first 3 basically amount to unconditional surrender, the final war aim was added by Trump in his TV address, and that was regime change. They wanted to change the Iranian regime, remove the mad mullahs, the ayatollahs, and replace them with somebody like Delcy Rodriguez, the Venezuelan kind of puppet president that they have there now, who takes her marching orders from a WhatsApp conversation with US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. So what happened was the US failed in all of these war aims. In fact, it was so bad that it failed to secure even a single operational victory that might have taken them somewhere to achieving one of these strategic war aims. So it's not just that they suffered a strategic defeat; they didn't they didn't win a single operational victory on the way. And in the final analysis, that failure was due to Iran's missile and drone capacity. Ultimately, the US could not suppress Iran's ability to fire those weapons, and that allowed Iran to do a lot of damage to US bases and important military assets at those bases, most prominently anti-air batteries and these like irreplaceable radars that went with them, like super expensive systems and radars that are extraordinarily difficult and complicated to build, and were destroyed by Iranian missiles, which had surprisingly circular error probability accuracy. The other thing it allowed them to do was do really quite serious economic damage to US allies within the region. So we saw how Dubai was hit. We saw how that affected the tourist industry and the international business community that lives there, upon which the UAE economy partially relies. But the really big thing that the Iranians were able to do because of the US Air Force and Israeli Air Force inability to suppress Iran's missile and drone arsenal was that it could shut the Strait of Hormuz. And what that really did was it allowed Tehran to sanction planet Earth. It could bring about an energy crisis, or it could bring close an energy crisis, a global energy crisis, and thus an economic catastrophe for the world. And it could basically do that to hold Washington's feet to the fire and force it to desist. And ultimately, that's what Washington did. It did relent. It was ultimately forced to sign this memorandum of understanding in Islamabad, which was incredibly one-sided for the Iranians, effectively an Iranian wish list, in order to get the Iranians to relent, to stop, and allow the world economy to breathe again. Now, for those listeners who are also regular readers of the Multipolarity brief on the Multipolarity Substack, and by the way, if you're not a regular reader, start making yourself a regular reader. It's great. We get fantastic feedback. Some of the articles get really high quality comments, and if you haven't visited that so far, you should. But for those already do, they will know that we've long argued on the Multipolarity brief that the terms that the US signed up to would be unpalatable in Washington. It just would not be politically possible for Washington to swallow those terms. And I think that's kind of what it's proved. I mean, we argued that the only way Washington would swallow them is if there was a huge amount of economic pain being inflicted by Iran. And that level of economic pain wasn't apparent when the US signed the MOU. So to a certain degree, we were surprised. We ultimately believed that Iran had the upper hand because of this counter-value missile campaign it had run, because of its ability to inflict so much economic pain. We believed that ultimately Iran would get the terms it wanted, but that it would take a lot of economic pain because it was so unpalatable in the United States. So the US signed earlier than perhaps we thought, but it has indeed proved that those terms are just unpalatable in Washington. And what the US did, really between the ceasefire and signing the MOU, and since signing the MOU, it's been trying all these strange schemes, whether a full-blown blockade, or whether trying to get ships to run through the strait under military escort, or various other little schemes. It's been trying them constantly to whittle away and eventually remove Iran's ability to control the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if the Trump administration could achieve that, what they would essentially do is they would remove Iran's ability to sanction planet Earth. They would remove Iran's ability to inflict all of this economic pain. And while Iran could still do damage with its missiles to US allies within the region, well, that's damage that the US would be willing to take from a distance of 7,000 miles away in order to be able to pressure Iran to give it across the negotiating table what the US had failed to achieve on the battlefield. So that's what's been going on, really. Like, the US has been in this constant campaign of just like whittling away. Oh, now we'll send the ships through this channel. Now we'll rush several ships out at once. Now we'll do this. Now we'll do that. Now we'll blockade the strait. Now we'll try this scheme. They've been trying slowly to erode Iran's control of the state by making it effectively open international waters again, and thus removing Iran's key point of leverage in the forthcoming negotiations to establish a final peace treaty. So finally, last week, what happened was Iran drew a line in the sand and said, no, this is straight out. We believe we control because we've won it in war as a spoil of war. And we will not accept you attempting to do this. We refuse. In the MOU, we said that we would let ships out free of charge without a toll for 60 days if they were under our supervision. And our supervision, as far as we're concerned, is taking this channel and notifying the IRGC. So this is what we're going to do. And we are not going to allow you to remove this really big point of leverage. That is exactly why the war has flared up. Now, it might kind of sound comical that the US is now fighting a second war using the same tactics and the same capacities it had in the first war, which it failed in order to reopen a strait which was open before it started the first war. That is true, and I suppose it is funny when you think of it like that. But ultimately, the stakes are really high here, because if Iran does hold on to the strait, if Iran does effectively keep it shut down, if it can defeat the US in the US's efforts to reopen the strait and get ships freely moving through it, even if it's not fully, partially, then it has huge leverage in order to achieve almost everything it wants in negotiations. And that, in turn, would provide Iran with the base to recover economically, probably for double-digit economic growth. It would provide Iran the base to gain effective hegemony over its Western near abroad. And ultimately, it puts Iran in the rank of the great powers. So I actually think that there is much to suggest that Iran will indeed win this battle for the strait. I've given you the framework of how to see events, the strategic military landscape, the contours of the war, what this flare-up is really about. And now I'm going to try and give my prognosis for how I think this is going to go. And I think that really there's a lot to suggest that Iran will indeed win this battle. So the first is that the strategic military landscape has not changed in the last 6 weeks. The US still has no ability to suppress Iranian drones and missiles. Even as the US Air Force is focusing, laser-like almost, on the Iranian Gulf Coast and doing damage to Iranian radar and early warning and missile firing locations, Iran is still managing to slam cruise missiles into tankers and container ships. And that looks to me like exactly the same pattern as happened the first time around. Iran is also managing to hit and significantly damage US bases in the region in places like Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and Iraq. So, nothing about this new onset of hostilities suggests to me that much has changed with the military strategic reality. And if very little has changed with the military strategic reality, why should we expect a different outcome this time? The second point I would say in Iran's favor is that Iran's leverage and US pain is going to increase with time. So the longer this goes on, the more pain the US will feel, and thus the more leverage Iran will have. Trump might well have been wrong to say that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve would reach its limit within 4 weeks. He said that 4 weeks ago, by the way, and we're still drawing down now. So it hasn't reached its limit yet. But eventually it will reach its limit. Eventually they're not going to be able to withdraw down anymore on between 500,000 and 1 million barrels a day on average. They're just not going to be able to do that. It'll reach its limits beyond which the giant salt caves in which this oil is stored will start to break down because it needs the pressure of the oil inside to keep the walls from crumbling. Eventually, China will also have to return as a purchaser. We've talked many times on the podcast and in the multipolarity brief about how it was China who managed to balance the market by suddenly reducing its oil exports by 25%. But eventually that's going to have to end. It's going to have to re-enter the market as a buyer of oil. Now, when both of these things happen, the price of oil is going to go up. It doesn't matter how much the price of oil futures is being manipulated. It doesn't matter how much short sellers on the market are, long buyers on the market are afraid to really take big long positions because of all the shorts and because of the manipulation and because of the chance that oil will plunge on the day the Americans give up. Oil is just going to go lollapalooza, right? Like, if there's an outright shortage on the market, then it really is. Meantime, US elections are getting closer. So, I think that Philip had probably in his first essay has looked in detail on this. Philip has been doing great work on this, both on Twitter, but also on X-Streamers, Extremer Megastar, I suppose, Mariner Falls live streams on X, formerly Twitter. Philip has been going into real detail about this. But as this oil crisis gets closer and closer, as this energy crisis gets closer and closer, so, as I say, do the US midterms, and the political pressure on Trump really starts to build up. So again, I think ultimately we should expect a TACO event. I expect eventually the US will have to accept the terms which they signed up to in the Memorandum of Understanding. And those terms are going to be full sanctions relief, a return of Iranian assets that the US has frozen, redevelopment and reconstruction fund for Iran. I think $300 billion was mentioned. And in exchange, Iran will not put limits on its drone and missile arsenal. It will not reduce funding for its proxies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, but it will give the US some kind of JCPOA deal on the nuclear material. And I guess that just leaves the Lebanon and Israel as the main thorn in the side. But my view on that is that it's kind of solvable in that, from what I've seen so far, Iran isn't going to spoil its chances of securing such a deal because Israel is invading southern Lebanon. As long as the IDF is just mashing itself up against Hezbollah, then that's not going to be a deal breaker. But if Israel starts, leveling whole blocks of Beirut, then that would be a deal breaker. So America would have to tell Israel and credibly promise that Israel would follow the American orders on this, not to bomb Beirut. But apart from that, I think that's where this ends, because if it doesn't end, then you will eventually see a global energy crisis. And just because it hasn't happened so far, and just because the world has had, mainly because of China, and mainly because the US has been willing to send literally millions of barrels of oil from its Strategic Petroleum Reserve to Europe and East Asia, the energy crisis hasn't hit yet, but it will eventually. Oil is limited. China will eventually return to the market. So there's going to be either huge demand destruction, i.e. a massive recession. Demand destruction is what the economists call factories shut down and people stopping driving and heating their homes. That's, demand destruction. It's what we call a recession. Or the US is going to have to acquiesce to a deal which is broadly in Iranian terms. That's my prognosis, but I hope now I offered a kind of general framework to help you make sense of this, and that you might have your own prognosis. Until next time, dear listeners, farewell, good night, and good luck.